Hey everyone, this is Module 3, Lecture 7 of Introduction to International Relations. And what we're going to be talking about in this lecture are other theories, aside from liberalism, that make up this part of the module. So we're going to talk about several different theories or schools of thought, and hopefully they're going to give us some additional understanding about different ways to think about the relationships between states. So we have first an exercise that I want you to do wherever you're taking note of this lecture, wherever you're watching this, if you're watching this at home or at Starbucks or your grandma's basement, whatever. So what I want you to do is think about what the image on the screen right now means to you personally. What is it that is the first thing that comes to mind when you see the Benjamin Franklin $100 bill? So what I want you to do is write down whatever it is that you initially think about. You can pause this first, take a moment to reflect, and then come back to the lecture when you have written something down. Okay, so what is it that you've written down? I've gotten answers in the past that range from lots of different things, like it means freedom, it means I can buy beer for 2 weeks, it means I can put food on the table for my family. It means a hard-earned vacation is a little bit closer to realization. So lots of people have different ways of thinking about this, but one thing that we have all in common is that we believe that this money is worth something. If the money wasn't worth anything, then we wouldn't be able to use it, right? It's about the full faith and credit that the United States affords its citizens by distributing money. And so if this money doesn't have any value, you're not able to use it as a medium of exchange. So this is all a way of saying that, kind of to broach the subject of constructivism. And in constructivism, which is relating to the identity principle that we talked about in the first lecture, the meaning of things is socially constructed, which means that it's not just, right, the face value of this. I mean, we're talking about a piece of parchment that on its own doesn't have any kind of inherent worth. It's the value that we impute onto it that gives it some kind of value. And the fact that you're able to use this as a medium of exchange when you go to the grocery store, when you go to pay your bills, that's what's important about it. So it has meaning to you as far as being the person who possesses it. And then someone else, it's meaningful to them because they're willing to accept this for payment for a good or service. So that's kind of an entry point into a discussion about constructivism. The meaning of things is socially constructed. So what about constructivism in the context of international relations? Constructivists focus on how states construct their interest through interactions. So it's not just enough to know what other state capabilities may be, but we should pay attention to who their friends and enemies are, what is our prior history with those countries, do we have similar values, what are the most recent interactions that we've had with those countries, because all of these things together color how we treat other states. So constructivists say it's not enough to know about the material considerations that involve a state, but we also have to know about these more abstract, more ideational concerns as well. And getting back to the identity principle, in the context of this particular school of thought, it's not quite a theory, but we can talk about that later. It's the state's identity that matters, not just its military capabilities and interests. So how does the state see itself? What does it look like vis-a-vis other countries? Is it similar? Is it different? What kinds of governing systems do they have? What kind of values are their societies based on? What is it that if you were to affix a label to that one country, what would you say is the most important thing that stands out as far as the identity of that country is concerned, right? If you think about this in terms of the United States, someone might say, at least American anyway, freedom or capitalism or the rule of law. So these things are all embedded in the identity of the United States as a country. But this is not to say that identities are static or unmoving, right? Identities can change over time. The United States at one point was a very young country and hadn't really established itself other than for being kind of a a radical change in the way that societies were run, and it broke off from the United Kingdom. So what is it that we think of when we think of identities? Well, even our own identities, right, they change over time. I remember when I was in middle school, we had a teacher for a home ec class, and she said something that at the time didn't really make any sense to me, but the older I've gotten, the more I have felt like this is kind of a useful way of thinking about ourselves, right? And that is that your personality is the sum total of your life's experiences. So similar to that, the identity of a state is kind of the sum total of its own social experiences. And so the identity of a state can change through socialization. It can open its doors, right? Like China did during the 1970s. It can, as we talked about with respect to the United States, depending on whether it's isolationist or internationalist, it can be viewed more positively or negatively by members of the international community. So its interactions with other states color how those states interpret the identity of that state. And it can change based on how it interacts with those other states, whether those interactions are positive or negative, and so on. Another important thing is that not only do state identities change through the process of socialization, but what might be considered dangerous or even appropriate at a given point in time in international history is not something that is either universal or timeless, which means that what societies might consider to be okay at one point in history might not be okay at another. So we have to view the identity of a state through the lens of that particular historical period in time, right? Because a long time ago, slavery was considered to be appropriate and a peculiar institution that was nonetheless useful because of its economic benefits. But now today, the idea of human slavery is noxious to our very senses. And that's because the norms have changed, and the way in which that has shaped identities is also important to recognize. So we have to think about this not only in terms of how states interact with other states, but also what are the norms that are present in a given historical period and how that affects state identities. Another important aspect of constructivism is that states value their status in the international system, and reputation is social. It's not based on material factors according to constructivists. So this means that how a state interacts with other countries is more important than perhaps its military capabilities or the size of its economy or its natural resource abundance or anything like that. So a state, for example, a very small state can make a very big splash on the international stage due to its identity, not because of material factors. We can look no further than a country like Switzerland, for example, which is not one country that you come to think of normally as possessing bountiful, natural resources that can be used to develop economic goods, or a country that is, endowed with a large military presence. This is a country that is known, if anything, for becoming or staying neutral and during international conflicts, and also being a financial center for the world. So the status of a country like Switzerland is not really based off of its material factors, especially not in the way that we come to understand from the realist standpoint, military resources, right? But its reputation based on the norms that it promotes throughout the international system and the way in which it has maintained that posture for a long time has given it a place of pride in the international system. You also have smaller countries that have a role to play in the international system because of their status, and it may be just kind of token status. But years ago, the president of the Maldives, which is a country, an island country that is in the Indian Ocean, made a big deal about the role that climate change was going to play for the existence of that country. And so although it was a very small country and it was not known for having a large military, certainly not known for having a lot of land or natural resources outside of the beautiful beaches, it gained status in the international system because it was promoting certain ideas wrapped around resolving international problems. So constructivists, for constructivists, identity matters. Identities can change as a result of who they states interact with, or the historical period in which states are existing, and that states value their status, and their reputation is derived from social experiences, not from material factors. Okay, so to a constructivist, the international system looks kind of like this. You have this soup of things that all kind of intersect and float around to affect how states behave. You have ideas, right? You have international norms, some of which we've covered already, and then you have the interactions between states. And these things are floating around in the international system, and they affect what states do. So in this sense, all of these things help to constitute the state's identity. Together, this is, as I was making the analogy to our own personality, these are the aspects of the international system that kind of form the personality or the identity of states. And so what these things contribute to in the formation of state identities is what we call the logic of appropriateness. And by that I mean these things, ideas, interactions, norms, they help a state they inform a state's decision-making, its ability to interact with other states, what those interactions are like. So the state engages it in its behavior based on a logic of what is deemed to be appropriate given these conditions in the international system. That's different from another concept called the logic of consequences, where states think about, well, how am I going to be punished if I act in this way or not? Whereas the logic of appropriateness functions based off of these things like ideas, norms, and interactions to suggest that states do what's appropriate in a given setting, but that may change based on the historical period, and it may change based on the actor with which a state is interacting. Okay, so now we're shifting away from constructivism and moving in the direction of other social theories like postmodernism, which is an approach, not necessarily a theory, but an approach or school of thought that focuses on what people say, which is known as discourse, and what they write or text about international relations. And I don't mean text like this kind of texting, right? I mean the texts that are part of the fabric of the international system. So these could be things like decisions that are made by judges in international courts. They could be speeches that were written by or spoken by world leaders. All there. And in fact, there's a whole different literature that talks about what can and cannot be a text. So there's some debate about that, but it could be lots of different things. A protest and the signs that people have during an international protest against, say, the World Trade Organization could be part of the text that could be analyzed to understand from a postmodernist perspective what's going on in international economic relations. A very important point to mention here is that for postmodernists, there's no single objective reality, only experiences. So, for example, if I were to ask you what you think about this class, because at the very end of class, you're going to be asked to fill out a student evaluation. And we use these evaluations to understand what, as instructors, we're doing well, what we're not doing as well, and how we can improve upon the learning experience for our students. So if one way to measure this, right, of course, would be that I ask on a scale of 1 to 5, how good of a teacher I am, right? And so 1 is really bad and 5 is really great. And at the end of the day, I report a number and I say, oh, I am a 4 out of 5 on average rated by my students. And that gives me some kind of quantitative assessment of my ability as a teacher. But another way to approach that same subject about my ability as a teacher and your ability to learn from my teaching is to examine your experiences and try not to make them quantifiable necessarily, but to interview each and every one of you separately and to get a sense of what has been your lived experience within this online class. For some of you, maybe it's a positive experience. For others of you, it's a negative experience. But we're not going to add them all together and give me an average. What we are going to have is say, 50 different experiences from which I can draw certain inferences about whether you thought this was a good class or not. So it doesn't mean that at the end of the day, I was a good teacher or a bad teacher. It means that all of you had different experiences, and by asking you what those experiences are, I'm merely trying to capture these bits of reality, but I can't make sense of it in terms of one kind of concrete, totalizing conclusion. I only have an array of experiences from which I can draw some information about my abilities as a teacher. Importantly, going back to, remember when we talked about realism and liberalism and constructivism, realism in particular was the one that said, look, states are the only important actors and everything else is just kind of an aside, right? That international institutions, they're not nearly that important because the most powerful states are the ones that will dominate those institutions. So if we want to know how the UN is being run or how the World Trade Organization or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is being run, what kinds of decisions are being made, we just have to look at what the most powerful states who are part of that institution want. So they argue that institutions, not that important because ultimately the most powerful states are the ones who dictate the terms of what goes on in these international institutions. Postmodernists, on the other hand, say that states are not the only actors, that other actors are important to examine as well, and that we're missing critical pieces of the puzzle of understanding international relations if we only focus on states. Another important part of this is that there are hidden meanings that are not explicitly described in discourse or text, and we call these the subtext behind things. So one of my favorite quotes from The Simpsons is an episode in which Lisa Simpson is talking about one of her favorite jazz musicians, Bleeding Gums Murphy, and she says, you have to listen to the notes he's not playing. So what does that mean? That sounds crazy, right? Well, what it means is that there are things that are important about the tapestry of the music that are related to what is not being played, and that may be as important as the notes that we are hearing. So in discourse or text, right, it's important to understand the subtext, things that might be kind of floating under the radar that nonetheless might be very important, and even things that we maybe don't hear, right? So if you analyze a political speech and someone is asked a question directly, they're asked, do they support a nuclear war with North Korea, right? And so someone says, I think we should explore any and all possibilities as far as our foreign policy is concerned. Well, now if you just go by the letter of the law, right, what that person said, they didn't commit really to a response, but they left the opportunity open for exploring multiple avenues related to the question that was asked by a journalist. So what they didn't say was we should launch a nuclear attack on North Korea, but they left themselves open to the possibility because they didn't preclude that from their statement. So and this is just an example of subtext here, which I had to look around for this, and I didn't even realize until I found it through Google Images. But here you have a company that probably most of you are familiar with, which is Amazon.com. And if you look here at the way that the logo is designed, you can see that there's a couple of different things that are supposed to be, that sort of form part of what we call the subtext, right? The main text is Amazon.com. That is the web address that you go to if you want to access Amazon. You want to buy something online. But the additional arrow that we see provides some information that could be considered part of the subtext. And the little narrative at the bottom suggests a couple of different interpretations. One is a smile, right? It looks like it could be kind of like the old McDonald's smile that you would see on ads for Mickey D's. That could be a kind of subversive attempt to get you to think about the company positively. You're greeted by the company, the name of the company with a smile at the end. Or on the other hand, as the narrative indicates, it could be that it's signaling A to Z, which means you can get anything from A to Z at Amazon. They don't have to write that. They just imply it with the inclusion of a little yellow arrow. So this is what we mean when we say the subtext of something. Another important facet of postmodernism is that postmodernists reject trying to simplify the world into very tidy categories. They think that, again, what we need to do is generate meaning about international affairs, but we can't necessarily classify things into discrete categories that it's going to make us easy for us to like put them on a shelf and be able to say, capitalism is good and communism is bad, or autocratic regimes are bad and democratic regimes are good. Postmodernists are much more comfortable with fluidity and with flexibility and not kind of pinning something down to one sort of definitive view on it. There's complexity that's embraced, and you don't have to reduce it to a yes or no, right or wrong, good or bad kind of distinction. Okay, we talked a little bit about this when we discussed the role of the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, but just to kind of recap a little bit, Marxism is another social theory that some people use to understand international relations. And to be very brief, inequality between classes, Marxists will argue, shapes domestic and international politics. So what the Marxists who are operating at the level of international relations are arguing is that we take the same phenomenon that Marx noticed at the domestic level, which is that you've got the workers or the proletariat, and they're being exploited by the bourgeoisie or the capital-owning class, and this creates tension, and eventually the workers will unite and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then they will work together to establish a classless society where everyone's equal. Well, Marxists who approach international relations from this perspective will say, what if we just kind of upscale that idea to the international realm where you have states that maybe are kind of like the proletariat, we might call them the periphery, and then you've got states that are occupying the corridors of power, the capital-owning class, we'll call them the core, and that's where tension lies between the periphery, the poorer states that are being exploited by the core states that are using them for natural resources and things like that. And there's also some relationship with how the domestic politics within countries, Marxist and otherwise, contributes to how they act as on the international stage as state actors. So as I mentioned, right, IR theorists take this domestic theory about the tensions between the workers and the capitalist owning class, and they upscale that to international affairs, where they have the periphery or the kind of proletariat type country, and then you have the core or bourgeoisie type country, and that's what creates tension at the international level. So for Marxists, globalization of class relations involves the concentration of wealth in rich parts of the world at the expense of poor areas. So this is why you have claims of colonialism, or today neo-imperialism, where rich countries go into developing countries and try to access their natural resources. The people who are in the developing countries make very little, or some of the money that's made off of those natural resources is stolen through corruption. And so the argument really is that where there is this imbalance between the rich states and the poor states, and where capitalism is what drives the engine of the international economic system, you're always going to have this imbalance. You're always going to have tension between the two kinds of states, because the rich countries have a vested interest in seeing that the poor countries stay poor. If every country were to increase in its wealth, we would have problems with where we're going to find cheap labor, right? So the goods and services, many of which we have access to here in the United States or in the West in general, are as cheap as they are because they are manufactured or developed over in developing countries for much lower prices. So if all of the countries in the world suddenly became wealthy, all the prices would increase. So Marxists recognize this disparity and argue that we're always going to see tension between rich states and poor states because it's in the best interest of the rich states to keep the poor countries poor. Another group of social theories is what is known as peace studies. And here, peace studies analysts shift the focus away from the interstate level of analysis and towards social relations, but at all levels. So they kind of cut all the way down through the levels of analysis to understand why or what frustrates the prospects for peace in the international system. So it may be more than just knowing whether two states are operating antagonistically against one another, but it may be the case that if we look at how people are treated within countries, that tells us something about how those countries may act toward one another. Or what happens when individuals from one country go to another country, how they treat people in the host country. That may have certain impacts that affect peace within the country, whether we're talking about civil war or the likelihood of humanitarian intervention. So they look not just at the interstate level, but they drill all the way down to social relations at all levels. A really important distinction between peace studies and some of the other schools of thought or theories we have discussed so far is that advocates or analysts approaching international relations from the perspective of peace studies are very comfortable with the idea of active participation in political activities. So they don't shy away from advocacy and grassroots organizing and protesting. They feel that there is kind of an important contribution that can be made to improving the likelihood that the international system is peaceful as opposed to conflictual if the scholars themselves participate in those kinds of activities. And this is very controversial, right? Because for many people, this might invite criticism that these people are being biased, right? Their research, they're making certain arguments, but at the same time, they are actively advocating on behalf of those same causes, where someone who is kind of neutral and doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, may not be subject to the same charges that their research is biased. Because when we want to understand the perspective of an analyst or a scholar and what it is that they're trying to advance, and do they have an agenda that's underlying their research, well, scholars from the peace studies perspective say we actually should engage in these kinds of activities because what we're doing is just, we're promoting peace. But other people may look at that same activity or that same mentality and say, but that may detract from the seriousness with which people greet your research, because you appear to go into your research with an agenda, and that leaves you open to charges of bias. Peace studies analysts also look to alternatives to conflict, like conflict resolution, mediation, alternative dispute settlement, or dispute resolutions, as a means of settling these disputes, right? So they look for not just the evidence of war, but also alternative avenues to resolving conflict that don't involve the use of military forces, for example. And they also make the claim that unlike, or what is often suggested as a result of reading through realist literature, that war is not inevitable. It's not the kind of mainstay condition of the international system, but it is tied to cultures of militarism, right? So in the United States, and I give an example here, you can see there's a G.I. Joe action figure. So a peace studies scholar might argue that if we didn't provide little boys with G.I. Joe action figures, that might change their perception about what is the appropriate way of dealing with conflict in the international system. But by lauding a culture for its militaristic tendencies, and by making our soldiers into heroes and having small children from a very early age, right, play with soldiers, cowboys, and Indians as opposed to playing with cars, for example, that we're sending them a message about what our society values, what are the norms of our society. And so the argument would be that if we kind of unpack that and we reduce the culture of militarism in society, then maybe societies will be less prone to engage in war. And another important aspect of this is that violence is not something that's just, right, physical damage to people or infrastructure, but it involves structures themselves that contribute to a more abstract notion of violence. So you may have seen this term before, but this is basically just a more visual way of looking at it. This is a way of understanding what's known as structural violence. And so this is not, stabbing someone or launching a nuclear missile, but it refers to different aspects of our lived experience that may impact certain groups of people in negative ways, and so they form a kind of structural but not physical kind of violence. So, as a couple of examples here, look at the health quadrant, right? And it says, or the little health side of things, it says trauma of migration, sexual violence and violence of war, medicalization of abuse and social suffering. So, someone who has been the subject of sexual violence during warfare, this is not the same thing as having, a soldier shoot them or a bomb dropped on them from, 20,000 feet in the air. But it's the lived experience of somebody that contributes to their continuing trauma, their maybe mental health difficulties, which will have lots of lasting consequences on themselves and their families. Another one to look at here is employment, which is sort of on the opposite side of things for this chart. And it says lack of transportation and time off from work, ghettoization in dangerous and low-paying jobs, occupational health hazards. So maybe someone who is in a country doesn't have to worry that an opposing faction is going to break down their door and kill them at night, but maybe they worry about the level of pollution or the environmental health and safety at their workplace, and people are losing limbs. And so their daily interaction with systems of oppression suggests that what they really have to be concerned with are labor practices, not international conflict or civil war. So it all deals with what are the elements of our daily experiences that may negatively impact us in a way that is less well observed than, say, the kinds of physical violence or direct violence that we tend to think about when we discuss warfare and conflict. Also, another group of theories, which we're going to kind of delineate between, are what is known as gender theories. And the big message that we have gotten from lots of scholarship in this area is that there has been a tendency in traditional international relations scholarship to ignore the plight of women or gender issues. So gender theorists argue that, hey, gender matters in international relations. It tells us certain things that the conventional theories or the mainstream theories simply do not. In one way, it uncovers hidden assumptions about how we study relations among states. One of the more important lessons that we have gleaned from gender studies in international relations is that the core assumptions of realism are masculine. Think about all the way back to the lecture when we talked about realism, right? That human nature, if we're thinking about classical realism, is it's inherently bad. So people are always kind of out to get one another. Life in the state of nature is conflictual. People are always trying to overcome one another. Someone who is approaching international relations from the perspective of gender theories might look at those assumptions that realists use to understand how the international system works and say, wait a minute, I don't agree with that at all. The international system is not completely conflictual. It's not that people are inherently bad. In fact, there's lots of people who are doing good all the time. We just don't hear about it, right? It's kind of like when you watch the news at night. They're not reporting when someone did their job well, when someone gets a good grade on a test, when someone follows the speed limit. We hear about the negative things. That's what becomes most salient to us because of the way the media is presenting it to us. So someone who's approaching IR from gender theories might say, look, I disagree with the premise that basically states are always at odds with one another. It's far more likely the case that they agree or cooperate. And so I'm wondering where that idea came from. And they would argue that it is based on a masculine idea about international relations, not a gender-neutral idea, not a sort of feminized idea or anything like that. So a really important question that gender theorists look at is, how does gender affect views and decisions? Whether you are a male in power or a woman in power, or how do official decisions affect the livelihoods of different genders? So you've got several different strands that we're going to talk about. There are important distinctions to make between them. On the one hand, you have difference feminism. And here, this is the group of theorists who argue that women are unique. And in particular, they oftentimes argue that that women have by their very nature, a much more empathetic, kind, gentle approach to life. So we would expect, if you are a difference feminist, that world leaders who are women might be kinder, gentler, less likely to go to war. Women have a unique perspective that is not necessarily shared by men, and so it means that decisions made by women are therefore going to be probably less likely to result in war, more likely to result in negotiation, cooperation, and diplomacy. So this is one strain of feminism which argues women are special, they care more, they're more gentle, the gentler, gender, all that kind of stuff. But then there are other strands of feminism as well. There's liberal feminism, which argues actually there are no real significant differences. Men and women are equal. As you can see, Rosie the Riveter here, this famous poster, we can do it, right? And that's meant to suggest that women are capable of doing the same exact things that men are. The movement in the United States to kind of mainstream women into our armed services is a great example of this. The argument is that women are physically capable, mentally capable, emotionally capable of engaging in war in the very same way that men have been for decades. And so we should allow women to be soldiers on the front lines of battlefields. We should allow them to serve in any capacity that a man can serve in. So that's kind of a liberal feminist standpoint. Men and women completely equal. And then there's another perspective which relates back to when we talked about postmodernism a few slides ago, and that is postmodern feminism, where there, gender is completely arbitrary. So to give you an example, and I have a picture of Brienne of Tarth from Game of Thrones here just to kind of illustrate this point, right? A very powerful character in the TV show, one who's dedicated to protecting women, sees herself as being really integral in making sure that the Stark family stays alive. So for a postmodern feminist, these distinctions that we make between gender are not very meaningful. So the fact that in Western society, women tend to have their hair longer and men tend to have their hair shorter, it could just as easily be the opposite. If you think about some cultures, Peloponnesian cultures, for example, there are men who are lauded for being very masculine, but they tend to have, longer hair. In some societies, it's more appropriate for women to wear shorter skirts or shorts, and men wear, long shirts and longer shorts and that kind of thing. But that's really a fashion decision that has nothing to do with anything important. It's just about culture and societal norms. And then just as a final example, for a postmodern feminist, the fact that boys might play, who are very young, right, might play with G.I. Joes and girls might play with Barbie dolls is a function of societal norms that are imposed on them. But a boy who's born will not necessarily gravitate naturally toward a G.I. Joe, and a girl might not gravitate naturally toward a Barbie doll. We put them in their hands to begin to reify gender norms so that they can understand what the rules of society are. But that it just as easily could be the opposite, where boys are playing with Barbies and girls are playing with G.I. Joes, and that distinction between what boys are playing with and what girls are playing with or wearing or how they wear their hair, all of these things are constructed through society, but they're arbitrary. They're not meaningful in any real concrete way.